global priorities. So on this panel, we're going to try and explore what happens next with the economy, with trade, with foreign policy. I have two excellent guests with me. To my immediate left is Elisabeth Svantesson. She's the Finance Minister of Sweden. And to her left, we have Valdis Dombrovskis. He's the European Commissioner for Trade. He's also the former Finance Minister and Prime Minister of Latvia. Minister, let me begin with you. Just to sort of set the stage in terms of the strength of Russia's economy, we hear very conflicting things. On the one hand, in the last year or so, Russia is said to have overtaken Japan in terms of purchasing power parity for the size of its economy. A lot of analysts say that Russia has been able to transform its economy into a wartime economy and thereby able to resist a lot of the sanctions, mostly from the West. But on the other hand, there are all kinds of takes about how a wartime economy is imposing serious long-term costs on Russia's economy. From where you sit, I know this is an issue you deal with very closely. What is your assessment of Russia's economy?
First of all, thank you to having us here, and it's an important topic. I have been quite disturbed for quite a long time that the picture of the Russian economy is really reflecting Putin's narrative. He wants us to believe that the Russian economy is strong, everything is going pretty well, but when you dig a bit deeper, you'll see that's not the case. So for a year or so, I have been digging into this with civil servants, of course, and researchers, and I commissioned a report in Sweden, which it was ready just maybe 6 months ago, and it's very clear that the Russian economy is definitely as strong as Putin wants us to believe. And the problem that I think here we have, economic institutions, media, we as politicians have reflected that what you started with, but with different sources, and definitely not just Russian public figures, we see that the inflation is much higher than their public figure says. Just a month ago, it was somewhere between 20–22%.
Okay.
And the central bank has it's like 21% now the rent. So that also says something about the state of the economy. So inflation is high. They have trouble to get things when they need more defense material. Of course, it takes time for them to get it because the sanction works. What does it matter if what picture is spread? It does matter actually, because Putin wants us to believe that sanctions doesn't work. He wants us to get tired of supporting Ukraine, and he also wants to tie the soldiers in Ukraine. So what picture we spread, and we can never get exactly to the truth, but much closer.
So you mentioned inflation. Just name two or three other indicators that suggest to you things are much worse than we hear.
Capital flight, definitely so. Inflation, and it's a lack of shortage when it comes to workers. And if it was so that the GDP is as high as Putin says, okay, we can explain that with a lot of producing material, of course, to the war. But we have another, as many of you know, probably. One way of measuring is that night light time emission. When you see from 21 to 23, there is, over Moscow, for example, a much darker picture. You have these satellites, and you see it's quite a common way of.
They're not using as much electricity.
No, it's much darker. So that would tell us the GDP might have gone even under zero. We don't know, but what we know is that his narrative and his truth is not true.
Okay. Commissioner Dombrovskis, curious if you agree with that, but you work a lot on the sanctions on Russia. How do you think about America's role? It recently, with the Biden administration in one of its parting acts, increased and enhanced the number of sanctions on Russia, especially in the oil sector. Why do you think America waited for so long to use something that it had in its arsenal? And what more can the world do?
First of all, it's clear that we as a Western democratic world, we need to continue to put pressure on Russia as long as it continues its aggression against Ukraine. And we need to make sure that also Russia pays for the damage it's creating in Ukraine. Looking at our sanctions, I would say overall sanctions are working, and Madam Minister already outlined a number of parameters. Even official inflation in Russia in December reached 9.5%. There are independent research organizations like Romer, which are putting this figure much higher. Central bank base interest rate stays at 21%. National Wealth Fund is decreasing rapidly, especially its liquid part. Interest rates for refinancing are increasing in Russia now, reaching 16%. Ruble has depreciated against all major currencies, including Chinese yuan, where they do more and more transactions in yuan, especially for trade in sanctioned goods. So we see also a decline in different industrial sectors. But it's also true that not that we know the full picture, because Russia has stopped publishing a number of economic statistics since the beginning of the war, and not that we can trust Russian official statistics. So there are also indirect methods, as the Minister outlined, which we need to use to tell state of play on Russian economy. Then we must remember that indeed Russia's largest source of revenue is their energy exports, oil and gas primarily. And there indeed we can do more. So G7 has introduced Russian oil price cap, $60 per barrel. But Russia is finding ways around it, operating its shadow tankers fleet, which is now also increasingly being sanctioned. Then, for example, on Russian gas, for example, the European Union has not been able to agree on sanctions of Russian gas. Well, still, we have reduced this dependency quite dramatically. So, not least because the Nord Stream pipelines were actually blown up. But the imports of Russian LNG currently are actually increasing. So there are ways that we can still put more pressure on Russia, especially through this energy sector. And it's certainly a good news that US has now ramped up pressure still by outgoing Biden administration.
Commissioner, if I may, this always raises the question, if there's more room to have stricter sanctions, why haven't you used that before? Why not impose tougher measures earlier? In an earlier part of your career, you served with Jean-Claude Juncker, and he had this well-known line that we all know what to do. If we did it, we wouldn't get reelected. And it strikes me that part of what holds back Western leaders is domestic constraints. So either real fears about inflation, real fears about tough measures that will hurt them at home, and therefore, you know, there's a bit of a mismatch between the rhetoric of being tough on Russia and the actuality of what that is. I'll just say one more thing there, because I'm curious about the ghost fleet that you mentioned. There are reports that a lot of Russian oil, which ends up being refined in places like India, it ends up in Europe ultimately at cheaper prices. So Europe has found ways to essentially have its cake and eat it too, no?
First of all, indeed, it's a very valid question, and if you ask me, we could have and should have done more. Certainly domestic politics play a role there, and there's a dynamics is very different in different EU member states. So what is worth noting that to agree on sanctions, we need unanimity of all 27 EU member states. So, and the fact that we had been agreeing already on 15 sanctions packages says that we can agree on many things, and we have put indeed very wide-ranging sanctions against Russia, unprecedented sanctions, but we were not able to find that unanimity on everything. And I was giving this example of Russian natural gas, which is not sanctioned exactly because several member states were objecting to this. But then on impact on European economy, first, it must be said that Russia was trying itself to use their natural gas supplies as a tool of blackmail and manipulation back in 2022. And then we had to quickly move away from those Russian natural gas supplies, which we actually did. So by now, Norway is our biggest gas supplier. United States is our biggest LNG supplier, so we import more than half of our LNG from United States. So we're working also with other suppliers. So we were able to find the alternative supplies, and Russia cannot use this tool of pressure against us anymore. And otherwise, there are not so much implications for European economy concerning the Russian sanctions. So economically, certainly, we can do more. Important part is to find political consensus.
Are you able to confirm if the Ghost Fleet supplies Europe with energy as well?
Well, it's certainly not a question of ghost fleet, because a ghost fleet is exactly the ghost fleet that it's not allowed to enter, for example, European ports. And now in our latest sanctions package, we were actually adding a number of those ghost fleet tankers to our sanctions list, so they are now directly sanctioned entities, so no one is doing business with them. But certainly we are following also other developments. It's true that Russia has found alternative markets in China, in India, in other places, and something we need really to follow, that then just refined products which has this Russian oil does not end up in Europe. That's a very valid question and very valid issue for us to follow. And generally, right now, with a very wide-ranging sanctions which we are already applying against Russia, increasingly important element is fight against sanctions circumvention, because as we are applying sanctions, Russia is looking for ways to circumvent them.
True. Minister.
Yeah, I do agree with what Valdis said, and I will just add that, I mean, it's oil that financed the war, first of all. So that's why I think we should, and Sweden, together with the Nordic Baltic countries, is working hard to get that we should lower the price cap, because that will make a great difference, because oil is first of all the revenue.
And it's not low enough right now, because clearly, you know, Russia is able to still finance this war. There's a related element here, and that's the role of big multinational companies. So the Kyiv School of Economics has some data as of 2023 that shows that 800 multinational companies from Western and like-minded countries are still operating in Russia. Half of these are companies from the US, Germany, and France. Why do you think that's the case, that Europe hasn't been able to exert more penalties on big companies from doing business in Russia?
It's a good question. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to what Valdis said. We are 27 countries, so we have been united in many things. But when it comes to implementing and also scrutinize this, it's important to put pressure on the bigger company. And many big companies, they have different, I mean, they don't operate all by themselves, they have different companies around them. So, but I think we need all to be much more specific and very clear that it's not acceptable. Like IKEA, they've closed down, Swedish IKEA, Russians,
right?
Is right, it would go that so good, I guess, but anyway.
Yeah.
I hope. And more has to be done, and more has to be done by the companies, of course. So it's not a perfect world, definitely, and I would like more to put pressure on Russia with the oil cap, with not exporting to them, and we have to do more on the shadow fleet, as Valdis says. So much has to be done, and if we think a bit in the long run, the day will come when the war is over. We don't know when. But then all investments that have taken place in Russia right now almost is in the war.
Correct.
So, I mean, the ruble is very weak, the investments, the economy is weak, capital fly. So it will be some tough years after the war too, of course. Let's continue to pressure, and we do that as a country, and we have to do that as companies too.
So I would be crazy to not bring up the elephant in the room today and this entire week, and that is U.S. President Donald Trump. We're here to talk about Russia, so I'll use that framework to think about Trump's influence. But, you know, he has in the past said he could resolve the war in one day. He has in the past, and more recently as well, said that NATO needs to up its defense spending to even 5%, which would cause all the same problems that you're describing in Russia in Europe. How do you respond to that?
First of all, I mean, I wasn't so surprised of anything in the speech, but I was a bit sad that Ukraine, he didn't mention Ukraine, and that is troubling, I think, of course. We'll see what happens, because yesterday, me and Valdis was the same meeting as a good friend of mine, Sergei Marchenko, who is Minister of Finance in Ukraine. He came to ECOFIN, and I visited him. When I see his work, when I see all the soldiers, I mean, they are doing so much to not only to see that Ukraine will be free, but that Europe will be free. It's so much more to do, and I hope that the new administration also wants that. But if it's so, that they won't do as much as we hope, we have to do more. Now, when it comes to defense spending, on one hand, it's reasonable that Europe do more, because US has done very much, so that's reasonable. So I think we have to do more. But I don't think maybe even Trump wants 5% from them, because he, I mean, US
That's what he said.
Yeah, but
I mean,
US is also
it was hard enough for NATO countries to up to 2%, so 5% is a huge jump.
Definitely. So it won't be 5%, but because I don't think Trump wants for the US economy have 5%, because they have quite a large debt. Yeah,
that's true. That's very well put. Commissioner, similarly, you know, I know you work closely with your American counterparts on sanctions. What is your sense of how a change in administration in the United States will change overall strategy towards Russia?
First of all, we must understand that this is a war which is taking place in European continent. So, as European Union, we cannot shy away from this. So, it's clear that it's first and foremost for Europe to react. And given the fact that Russia is openly talking about invading other countries if they are successful in Ukraine, it's on one hand important to provide all the necessary support for Ukraine, that they can defend themselves, because they are also actually defending us, but also to ramp up our own defense capacities and defense industry. And talking about defense spending, you mentioned those 5%. So for countries which are bordering Russia or Ukraine, like Baltic states, like Poland, they are already raising defense spending to about 3% of GDP and aiming for 4%. So it just has become a necessity. So we were reaping this peace benefit maybe since the end of the Cold War, when the world could afford spend less on defense and spend more on something else. But now with Russia behaving like an aggressor, that has changed, and so we have to change as well.
I have to point out, America may also behave like an aggressor with Denmark. It's a possibility you have to keep in mind.
Just maybe to finish on this cooperation on US. So our approach on cooperation with US is that EU and US are strategic allies. We are like-minded partners, and especially in situation where autocracies are challenging the current rules-based international world order, it's important that democracies are working together, and it is with this spirit of cooperation that we are approaching also the new Trump administration.
But with there is a very clear change in outlook between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. I understand you're being very diplomatic, sir, which you must do. But there could be similar changes in Europe as well, with elections in Germany and France coming up. There is a rightward shift globally. How does that impact, and especially with your job of being trade commissioner? We're in a world now where countries are turning inward. They're more protectionist. They focus more on their own domestic industrial policy. They want less globalization. And all of this, to bring it back to Russia, helps Russia, because in a world in which Russia is forming its own blocs, we haven't talked yet about its burgeoning alliance with North Korea, China, and Iran. How is Europe thinking about that?
That's exactly what I was mentioning, that it's not Russia alone. Indeed, it's finding allies, including North Korea, and it's worth noting that there are North Korean troops, significant numbers of them, already engaged in this war against Ukraine. It's already happening. It's forging closer ties with Iran, which is supplying with different weapon systems, including Shahed drones. So it's clear that we must look also beyond Russia in this response, and if there is some kind of axis of autocracies forming, it's important that we are also having our alliance of democracies to counter that. And there is cooperation with US, but also with other like-minded partners in G7 and beyond the G7 is going to be very critical, and that's how EU is going to approach it.
Just give me a yes or no answer, but you still see the United States as like-minded, given that President Trump denied that he lost the last election, given that he just pardoned all of the people who were involved in the January 6th insurrection. You still see the United States as like-minded?
We have United States as a strategic partner and ally for many decades, and we see United States as indeed like-minded. Of course, we see that we are going to have challenges with Trump administration, what is now being talked about tariffs. There are other areas where it's going to be difficult, but we are ready to engage very closely with the new administration. Also, there is uncertainty surrounding what exactly stance the Trump administration will take vis-à-vis Russia and in terms of supporting Ukraine. But we are ready to engage on those discussions and find, to the extent possible, common solutions.
Minister, you mentioned that there could be a settlement one day, and we have to think about that day and the day after. What is your sense of, if there is some sort of a settlement, what kind of relations are you going to have with Russia after that?
I guess it's a bit too early to say, but we will definitely have a strong relation with Ukraine, stronger than before, and help them rebuild the country, using the frozen assets and the more than we have done probably and help them. But I mean, Russia has chosen its way. I mean, we have seen this coming, not exactly this war coming, but the path that Putin and the Russians have pointed out. And I guess we were probably naive 10, 15 years ago, and we shouldn't be naive in the future. I mean, it can take long before we have good relations with Russia. And it's not in our hands. It's really in Putin's and the coming government's hands. So I think we're problematic, and it's sad because we want things to be better, not worse. And right now it's a bit hopeless in some areas and hopeful in others. Because when we in EU, I mean, we are 27 members, countries. When we talk now about Trump and tariffs, or we talk about the war, in Russia's war in Ukraine, I mean, tariffs is no problem at all compared to that we have war in Europe. And also, tariffs and US policy is, let me say this, we have our own destiny in our own hands, Europe. So we have to do more, both with economic growth and cooperation, and show that it's good. A market-based economy is good. And we'll continue to help Ukraine to make them stronger. And we'll see how the relation with Russia will be. But I think it will take a long time before we have good relations.
We're almost out of time. I just want to check if there are any questions in the room. Okay, in which case I'm going to ask one last question to you, Commissioner. President Zelensky of Ukraine has been here this week, and first in his speech, it struck me that he was talking a lot more about Europe than he has in the past, and separately when he was speaking with a few of us reporters on the sidelines on the record, it seemed to me that he was quite upset with Europe, because a lot of promises have been made about joining NATO, still hasn't happened. B, the security guarantees that they need for the future seem so much up in the air and so dependent on the United States. So there's a little bit of anger at Europe that I'm detecting. And to bring this all back to Russia, the reason why this matters is the longer this war goes on, the more of a problem it is for Europe and for Ukraine, of course. And the question I think Ukraine keeps asking is, why do you always give us enough to survive but not enough to win? What is Europe's answer?
That's a very valid question, and if we talk specifically on weapons delivery, we certainly should be giving more to Ukraine. We have now enough to cover Ukraine's financing need for this year, thanks to our Ukraine facility, thanks to the G7 extraordinary revenue acceleration loans. But we need to do more in terms of military supplies. That's critical right now, and we need indeed to work towards a peace solution which is just and lasting, which does not encourage Russia to continue its aggressive wars, because that's what Russia is clearly talking about. And yes, we need a very clear security guarantees for Ukraine, and the best security guarantee in this case is a NATO membership. Okay, that's not European Commission's business, obviously, but personally, that's what I would support, because we know Ukraine has security guarantees. When it gave up its nuclear weapons in the early 90s, there were Budapest Memorandum and security guarantees, including from the United States, from Russia itself, or many countries. But we see that these kind of security guarantees have not really amounted to as much as they should have been. We are still discussing that there are not sufficient support for Ukraine to fight against Russian aggression. So therefore, the question is what other type of security guarantees we can have, and it was a mistake back in 2008 that Ukraine was not admitted to NATO, because Russia as aggressor is not provoked by strengths. It actually is the only thing it understands its strengths. Russia as aggressor is provoked by weakness. sanctions. So, and that was what provoked at Russia. So Putin saw Ukraine as a weak target. And okay, it's a 3-day war. It's lasting already almost 3 years, and this target has not turned out to be so weak after all. And we have provided lots of support, but that's the only language which Russia understands. So we need to demonstrate strengths, and we need to integrate Ukraine in Western structures. We have already started accession negotiations for European Union with Ukraine, but in terms of security, of course, NATO is key.
I mean, of course, Zelensky is stressed and he can be angry on us. I mean, it's a war. Let me just remind you, Europe, EU is not the Commission, but they have good commissioners. We are 27 countries, members, and we do a lot bilaterally. Also, many of us. So we do things together, and I'm very happy for that. But we also do things bilaterally, and we will continue to support. Sweden will do. We have a set of 25 billion Swedish crowns every year now, just for support, and then EU has to do more, and we have to do more sanctions. So I don't think Zelensky should be grateful. I mean, that they are fighting a war for us.
Correct.
So we have to do more. So it's not so strange if it does. And we will do more, and both Valdis and I, living where we live also, I mean, Sweden, and around all, I mean, you are even closer.
Yes,
border.
Indeed. Yes.
We are doing a lot, and we will do more.
Well, this is a question we'll have to re-engage with all year and beyond. Minister Svantesson, Commissioner Dombrovskis, thank you so much for your time. Round of applause, please.
Thank you.